Thank you very much, everyone, for inviting me. And I have in turn invited Wittgenstein and Hegel to walk with us for a while. We will go to a hilltop overlooking the disputed land of ontology and metaphysics, with its famous Baroque castles in the air and its historic scenic ruins visited every year by busloads of students, as well as its modern, sleek, logical factories and austere monuments. This may seem an unlikely place to bring Hegel and Wittgenstein together. Hegel feels at home in this fantastic land. After all, he wrote one of the earliest guidebooks for travelers there, and he also wrote a handbook for those seeking citizenship there. Wittgenstein, however, finds the area distasteful. He finds it as an area of traps and illusions. He would like to return to a simplified house in Vienna, or perhaps an ordinary flat in England, or to a friend's house in America. In America, conversing with O.K. Balsma in October of 1949, Wittgenstein praised the logical work of Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead, but he scorned Whitehead's later turn into ontology and metaphysics. Balsma records that Wittgenstein said, "Whitehead was really good once, but then he became a high priest and a charlatan." We know that Wittgenstein could wield contempt like a sword and often wounded himself. Hegel's grand scheme should also earn that contempt, but I will try to persuade the two thinkers that they share certain projects, even though their paths do diverge. I've structured this walk using an excerpt from Hegel's encyclopedia, from the Zusatz to paragraph 246 in the introduction to Hegel's philosophy of nature. Here's the text. I'll read the English. Metaphysics is nothing else but the entire range of the universal determinations of thought, as it were the diamond net, into which everything is brought and thereby first made intelligible. Every educated consciousness has its metaphysics, an instinctive way of thinking, the absolute power within us, of which we become master only when we make it in turn the object of our knowledge. All education reduces to the distinction of categories. All revolutions in the sciences, no less than in world history, originate solely from the fact the spirit, in order to understand and comprehend itself with a view to possessing itself, has changed its categories, comprehending itself more truly, more deeply, more intimately, and more in unity with itself. I'm going to go through this bit by bit. Both Wittgenstein and Hegel observe the nets of categories we use to structure our experience of the world. Diamond-like, transparent, indestructible. Are they Kant's categories or Hegel's? Yes, Hegel is aiming for that. But no, in this paragraph he has other categories in mind. Actually, the longer paragraph is a comparison between categories from his philosophy of nature and categories from the science of his day. So he doesn't necessarily mean philosophically rigorous categories. Wittgenstein would not speak of diamond nets, but he does speak of grammar, and their nets of internally related concepts. He distinguishes between statements showing internal relations and statements expressing empirical relations and causal connection. Every educated consciousness, we're told, has its metaphysics, which means there are many diamond nets. Both Hegel and Wittgenstein describe these nets of concepts and practices we find in the world. The nets can be, as Hegel says, instinctive, that is, they're not constructed self-consciously. In the philosophy of nature and spirit, Hegel describes organisms' growing abilities to discriminate, and there are many stages of developing self-reference. Then Hegel finds many diamond nets in history and politics and art, and he tries to understand and master them. Wittgenstein, for his part, finds multiple language games and forms of life, many grammatical nets, most not consciously planned, we must learn not to be mastered by men, or by the pictures they suggest. Now, could I call these diamond nets ontologies? Yes, I think we can. But we have to be careful about our words, and I will distinguish three senses of the term ontology. The first, and the one which best fits this level, is also the most common use of the word outside philosophy. We use this term when we ask about the ontology of a database, or of a computer game, or of a bureaucratic procedure. What types of entities are taken as significant for this practice? What are the relationships? What are the rules and moves that are possible with them? Put another way, what is the repertory of objects to be discussed? How are they to be connected, or used, or played with? Such diamond nets allow us to classify objects, make moves in a game, or study social phenomena. Slab, brick, carry, put it on the line. The rook moves along the board in straight lines, forward and sideways. Temperature, humidity, and barometric readings are recorded hourly in the database, correlated with the velocity and direction of the wind. These 19th century novels will be analyzed in terms of the connections between the characters' actions and the locations where they occur. So these kinds of ontologies set up practices of analysis and classification. They develop naturally, but they can also be planned and regimented. There are many of them. They don't necessarily compete with one another, but they can be rivals, as when we choose which constitution we want for our new city, or what conventions to use in playing a game of bridge, or different databases for analyzing economic history. These ontologies are pragmatic, in the sense that they are tried and tested in our interactions with the world. They're not philosophically self-aware or justified, and they don't need to be. Now, this first mode of ontological discussion needs to be distinguished from a second mode used very strongly in 20th century philosophy. Many ontologies are now to be analyzed, and there is still a list and rules and moves, but there's to be a final list, a minimal list. Many ontologies will be translated, regimented, to a final ontology, which is including only the most foundational entities. Once the scientific revolution challenged the idea that the objects of ordinary perception might not be fully real, local vocabularies began to be questioned, and the philosophers began to worry about how to determine the basic reality. This mode of analysis was strengthened in the 20th century with tools of linguistic and logical analysis, theories of reference, model theory, and the like. Nowadays, the basic sets of entities are usually being suggested by the latest and best science. There are whole libraries filled with disputes about how to perform these reductions. Wittgenstein refuses to play that game. Surprisingly, Hegel too refuses the game of reductionism. Now, you say, wait a minute, isn't he the complete reductionist? Doesn't he say there's only one entity, spirit? Well, he does say that. But he doesn't mean it as a theory of reductionist reference. You can't understand what he's saying until you understand spirit's mode of existence. Hegel doesn't think spirit exists as an immediate, present object of reference, a simple factual presence. He argues that any simple factual presence on any level results from complex internal mediations and ongoing interactions. Spirit is not a big block entity, a big fact. It's not a Brandean absolute. It's an ongoing, self-reflective process. A process in what, you might want to say. But Hegel argues strenuously that that's the wrong question. One of the goals of the phenomenology and the logic is to eliminate any possibility of an external view of spirit, as if it were an object that we were studying from a distance, rather than the act and structure of studying itself. Is that different from Wittgenstein's refusal to let philosophy make absolute ontological claims? Yes, no, maybe, we'll see. To do so, we need to consider a third, and indeed the oldest use of the word ontology. The study which Aristotle called first philosophy is a study of being qua being, to on he on. He sees categories that can be used to deal with any local language or form of life. He brings to those local ontologies his own set of tools. They're not a list of the fundamental entities, but a list of the fundamental ways things can be. Ontologia, in its purest sense, the study of what it is to be. His basic toolbox includes the concepts of the four causes: matter, form, substance, quality, relation, quantity, and above all, the notions of actuality and potentiality. Using these tools, he can analyze historical change, biological reproduction, the writing of poetry, the growth of cities, political proposals, and the marine fauna that he loves so dearly. He describes the being of entities presented on many different levels in local ontologies. He does not reduce them to one single level, but he tries to give a sense of the mode of existence at any local level. So, for instance, attacking Plato. He does not reduce Plato's universal forms to the nominalist collection of particulars. Rather, he argues that the mode of being of Plato's forms, the way they are supposed to exist, renders them powerless to achieve the functions that Plato wanted them to achieve. When he discusses pre-Socratic theories on the nature of matter, he argues that the modes of being for their proposed entities are not capable of accounting for the regular activities of nature. Hegel, too, does ontology in an Aristotelian mode. He's not trying to produce the ultimate list of the truly basic entity. He doesn't produce an ontology in the logic, but he produces a set of categories, a toolbox, which can be used to analyze and clarify any local ontology. Hegel's analog to Aristotle's toolbox of substance and potentiality and so on are the categories developed in the third section of the logic, the doctrine of the concept, that involve the permutations and combinations of universal, particular, and individual, laid out in the discussions of judgment and syllogism, and their development further in the notion of the idea. He uses these categories to analyze space and time, the solar system, types of rocks and geology, biological processes, levels of subjectivity, the different branches of government, and so on, including a self-reflective account of the genesis of the categories themselves. This crystallized sequence of categories does not precipitate out into a final reductive list. It rather is a sort of self-aware notion of categories, which allows you to criticize or to locate the various local ontologies. None are denied, but they are put in their place. Local ontologies get swept up into the motion, but they're left where they are. Different local ontologies continue to function, but within an awareness of their, it's hard to find the right word, limitations, that's not quite right. Locations, that's not quite right. None of those terms are quite right because they suggest a static whole, like a jigsaw puzzle being assembled, and that's not what he's doing. Hegel's proclaimed absolute knowledge, an absolute idea, is really a comprehension of the process of developing local ontologies and the activity of spirit understanding them. Hegel usually lets local ontologies be, noting their inadequacies. But when someone tries to draw from inadequate categories political or artistic conclusions that he doesn't like, then he will apply corrections using his own. To criticize, say, a proposal about the legislature of the city, or how to treat students, or how to structure a curriculum, he will do what Aristotle did, namely present the concepts from the rival theory, show how he thinks they are inadequate, and provide a better recommendation based on his own. And if he thinks the practical issue is really serious, he will criticize the rival theory with a contempt that Wittgenstein would recognize. Both Hegel and Wittgenstein want us to become aware of these diamond nets that we live in. They both want us to find a new freedom within them, even as we realize how we are constituted by them. Diamond nets are not infinitely pliable. They have their own constraints. We become their masters when we realize that they are not arbitrary creations. The master potter knows his clay. The sculptor knows what marble can do and not do. Wittgenstein wants us to become master craftsmen, understanding our language, what it can do, what it cannot do, what changes we can't make, what changes we can't make. Hegel, too, hopes for such a sensitive awareness of our situation and concepts, though he pictures this awareness arising through a unique, pure experience of thought. Hegel conducts exercises in studying and manipulating ontological concepts, feeling out their connections and movements, their flexibilities, their resistances, coming to understand their pattern of movement that is the way they are, their mode of being. And then when Hegel looks out over the land of ontology, he sees antique constructions whose architects thought they were solid, but the structures were riven with inner tension. But he also perceives how the architect's tools were refining themselves. If he can plan the right path among the castles and the ruins of the way, a traveler who can go on that path can come to see how the diamond nets were growing subtler, and finally, when he reaches the final palace, the traveler will see in its corridors and rooms the self-comprehension of the traveler's path and the principles of its design. We could speak of these torturous explanations as a kind of philosophical therapy. Hegel sets us exercises in working through negativity, accepting change, reconciling us with our situation, freeing us from constraining mode of thoughts, just like therapy is supposed to do. One-sided questions get pushed aside. Dualities are transcended. Hegel's desired effect resembles Wittgenstein's linguistic therapy, insofar as it dispels illusions, turning us away from fruitless quests that we think we must follow because we're under the spell of inadequate category. Now, at this point in our walk together, Wittgenstein can hold it in no longer. He screams, "Kolb, no! I protest. I don't accept your parallel." Hegel and I see the history of ontology and metaphysics very differently. He may see an optimistic progress, but I see a wasteland littered with wrecked projects and delusive monuments, with mazes and confusion amid the ruins. And then you see him trying to offer some total vision of spirit that encompasses all that diverse wreckage. But that vision of spirit is just another trap, trying to domesticate my ideas and lock my philosophical practice in a systematic cage. And even worse, to continue the insult, you have the nerve to try to make my philosophical therapy and Hegel's dialectical manipulation sound like have the same goal. But no, you miss the crucial difference. I lead the fly out of the fly bottle. Hegel constructs a more intricate bottle to imprison the fly. The true therapy is to let the fly go free. Before I can reply to this outburst, Hegel begins to mumble, "Wittgenstein, what kind of freedom are you offering the fly? The open space outside any bottle still has its own geometry and curvature. Our logical space is finite and closes in upon itself. True freedom consists in moving with the natural curves of that space, not in some illusory infinite openness where all directions of flight are arbitrary and meaningless." Wittgenstein now begins a heated reply about geometry, but I interject, gentlemen, calm down, be patient. I suggest that your disagreements come from two deep roots. One, to use Wittgenstein's phrase, is a different diet of example, and the other is different notions about the weave of the diamond nets. They turn to me in explanation, and I say, "Wittgenstein, your examples tend to be simple language games, slab, promise. I know these are deliberately simplified, and they meant to show how to approach more complex mode. And Nino showed us yesterday how the simple do indeed contain possibilities of linkage. Nonetheless, your simple objects in the Tractatus and your simple language games later sort of suggest that more complicated social things get set up by assembling these little Lego bricks or atoms of social activity. That's wrong, says Hegel. To clarify my point, I recall an episode when I was teaching at the University of Chicago. Paul Ricoeur and I had some classes together on Hegel and Nietzsche. Once when we were discussing the then current analytic philosophy of action by Donald Davidson and others, Paul argued that those philosophers had picked the wrong kind of example. They sought to understand the status of intentional actions by taking a so-called basic action like raising your arm. Paul argued that those examples were too impoverished to really understand human action. They should have taken as examples full-bodied examples like starting the French Revolution or living in the feudal system. Those examples are movements in what Hegel would call shapes of spirit. And those are not wholes assembled out of already individualized components. They are complex unities inside of which their component sub-actions achieve individuality. For Hegel, a small example might be the operations of a national legislature or a city court system. So, I tell Hegel and Wittgenstein calmly, you speak at cross purposes because your concrete examples are very different in their nature. Furthermore, I said, the really key disagreement here is that Hegel affirms, and Wittgenstein denies, that the weaving of these diamond nets produces and depends upon internal tensions and contradictions. Hegel claims that these internal contradictions and whatnot have two sources. The first is that the individual diamonds in the net are not independent units. They depend on the net of connections for their identity. Wittgenstein would agree with this, given his doctrine of internal relation. But there's more. The diamond net is not a static framework of fixed relationships for Hegel. Apparently simple categories, such as form versus content, individual versus universal, thing versus quality, contain twists and mediation. Even and especially in the most abstract ontological categories, such as being, unity, and thing, achieve their apparent simplicity only within ongoing mediation. In the first part of the logic, categories that are supposed to be rigidly separated keep slipping over into one another. In the second part, categories that are supposed to be in dualities don't maintain a duality. In the third, categories come in triads where you can't make one a part of it first. Each member is both primary and mediated. These shifts are not shifts working up to a final static vision. These shifts and mediations are the way in which the categories exist. The second source of the diamond net's internal tension is the fold or the doubling within a shape of spirit, bringing change and revolution. In the introduction to the Phenomenology, Hegel claims that any form of consciousness which is aware of itself facing an object includes an implicit self-comprehension of that intended object and what consciousness must do to reach that object. Later, he argues that the forms of consciousness that are talked about later in the Phenomenology concretely exist within social shapes of spirit, and those depend on the same inner doubling, a self-comprehension of the shape's inner project of a social world and its mode of attaining mutual recognition. This twists an inner fold along which the shape of spirit can fracture when it fails to find itself at home in the world that it has projected. Wittgenstein interjects at this point that for him, our grammars, for instance, the grammar of a slab, getting a slab, or the rules for the game of chess, or the grammar of our talk about colors, have no internal tensions as far as they are diamond nets. They can produce contradictions and confusions if we misunderstand what grammar is or confuse internal and external relations. Furthermore, he insists that in use, a diamond net may prove unsatisfactory. For instance, color talk that we had might prove inadequate to discuss Caravaggio's painting. Or the rules of chess, which by themselves contain no inner contradiction, might be very dull, so we might change the game. Perhaps the move called castling in chess, where you move the king and the rook at the same time, was introduced to make things more exciting or to speed up the game. In any case, Wittgenstein would say, quite other rules could have been introduced. And the game could have been altered in many different creative ways. There's no single built-in self-understanding to guide the direction of change. There could be an external self-understanding when you use the rules to play a certain kind of game of chess. Hegel insists, though, that the problem goes deeper. The diamond nets within shapes of spirit make distinctions that cannot be maintained and define unions that cannot be achieved, not just because the world is recalcitrant and nasty, but because at heart the net's concepts secretly depend upon and shift into one another. The owl of Minerva doesn't just suddenly wake up and show us the inadequacies of our concept. Structural changes do not start from armchair reflection. Change comes when internal tensions reveal the inadequacies of a structure of experience. In the dialectic of master and slave, it's the production of labor of the slave that provides, in practice, a new form of selfhood that can be philosophically studied. Later in the phenomenology, in a section which I'm abbreviating terribly here, Hegel analyzes the structure of a post-feudal absolute monarch's royal court, say, here in Dresden, such as France's Ancien Régime. The courtier's life of dependence, struggle for recognition, constant demands for elegance and wit, but no substantive social goals, creates in practice a new kind of unrooted, active, but pointless selfhood. Combined with its cousin, an earnest enlightenment, self-fighting superstition, a new social role is created, the revolutionary demand for total freedom. It's not that the Ancien Régime, for some contingent reason or other, couldn't manage to deliver the identities and self-affirmations it promised. Rather, it has a social grammar that defines what is to count as being a recognized and affirmed individual in that kind of community. But the grammar's diamond net is woven out of particular versions of certain more abstract categories: form, content, individual, society, freedom, duty. Taken into themselves, these categories are not static objects. They're not platonic forms contemplated by a disembodied eye. They are schemes for actively thinking, grasping other active grasping. The mode of being is by bringing together opposed subsidiary categories, which have in turn to have been grasped already. Their own internal tensions are revealed when individuals are unable to verify themselves in the community, and the old shape of spirit fails to produce its proposed type of mutually recognized individuals at home in the world. The outline of that failure, Hegel claims, prefigures a new shape of spirit. The social grammar that defines certain key oppositions mutates into a new social grammar with new oppositions, each side of which includes what in the previous one had been irreconcilable opposition. Hegel calls this happening determinate negation. It's crucial to the necessity of his dialectic. It's one of the most valuable and one of the most vulnerable parts of his philosophy. Wittgenstein, on the other hand, produces examples that have little historical depth and provide no intermediate-sized social or historical concepts to guide changes. So Jean-François Lyotard can read Wittgenstein as claiming that the creation of new language games and forms of life happens through a discontinuous creative leap with no guidance except a sense of value that cannot be put into words. To my mind, that's a not satisfactory reading of Wittgenstein, but the ways of improving it have yet to be spelled out better. Hegel now wants to bring back his discussion about the natural geometry and curvature of logical space and its implications for history and liberation. But I break off the discussion here. For we are here up against another fundamental issue: the status of ontological and categorical grammatical analysis. How do the contours and movements of thought and language relate to those contours and movements of things in the world? That discussion could get very noisy and very nasty very quickly. But as you may have noticed, I have been implying that Hegel and Wittgenstein may not be so far apart on that as many of their feuding descendants think they must be. Now they're parting, the philosopher, but neither is happy with my attempts to force them together. Each now understands better what the other was trying to do, but each still disapproves of what the other is trying to do. Before they go their separate ways, I ask each of them to offer a suggestion to the other to improve the other's philosophical project. Hegel urges Wittgenstein to look more carefully at this example, at how they live within larger cultural units that question their supposed independence, and how they contain inner tensions. He suggests that Wittgenstein look carefully at what we do when we combine and coordinate language games, and that it's not a matter of assembling atomic units. Wittgenstein, in his turn, asks Hegel to consider that he might be being led astray by a picture of a pure, self-developing totality of diamond nets, a picture of the transparency of pure thought to itself, a picture of a single great narrative or action being accomplished. He urges the great proponent of history to face up to the historicity of his own philosophy, its language, and its self-understanding. When they leave, Hegel returns to his post on the bridge between the land of ontology and the world of politics. Wittgenstein returns to ordinary life. And we, ourselves, here and now, we go on with our ordinary philosophical lives, trying to find trustworthy paths and adequate shelters amid the mazes of philosophy today, whose paths owe many of their twists to our two recent companions. Thank you.